I'm very happy to be here. I'm here together with Elena. She's my co-founder. We both are co-founders of Evidently, where we help companies to test, monitor, and validate applications based on machine learning systems, both traditional and Gen AI, of course. Let me start from a little bit of introductions. As Matt already said, today I'm going to talk to you about some AI evaluations, because it's really, really important the day after you deploy something to production so that you can make sure that everything working exactly as you planned. Evidently is a very nice open source product. I built it, I love it. And we do have a lot of different reports, metrics, tests, which helps developers to understand whether there is any issues with data quality, with data drift, with LLM, AI applications, and any inputs and outputs. So yeah, it should be very interesting. And before I start talking about Gen AI, I just want to make sure that we are on the same page about agents, because we just joke around that nowadays you can call anything an agent. So when I say AI agent, I basically mean any system that has some routing ability, some memory, some tools to use, and basically can plan several steps ahead before generating an output. And yeah, actually the good question is why it's complicated. So why make it hard? And basically before, when we were talking about some standard systems, for instance, churn prediction or demand forecasting, it was much easier, because basically we just need to compare the generated outputs with some right ones, and we can just evaluate the share of correct answers. For traditional AI, it's much easier, because you can just compare the outputs with the correct ones, and that's it. But whenever we're talking about some unstructured data, like pictures or text, we cannot really compare pictures by pixels, right? It doesn't make any sense, or text by symbols. So we need to get more complex metrics. Also, quite often, we can create very different wording for a very same mean, right? And in this case, it should be quite interesting how do we compare the meanings of our text, for instance, right? So whenever we build some AI system, we need to come up with a very nice approach to have automated evaluations, which are quite complex and are very task-specific with very custom criteria. And that's what we are going to talk about today. So yeah, to start from, we do have software systems in production for decades, right? So we do have a lot of nice practices to test them. And my idea is to maybe derive the best practices from standard AI testing and try to apply it to Gen AI systems, specifically for agents. And when it comes to software testing, if you take a look to it pragmatically, we always start from some unit tests, then we move to integration tests, and finally we have end-to-end tests to see like the whole user scenarios. And yeah, of course we have some security tests, we have performance tests, but now I'm mostly focusing on the quality of scenarios, right? So just to be very, very focused specifically. And whenever we try to create some best practices for our tests, we are trying to do the following. We're trying to cover like the whole functions, whole methods, whole class by unit tests, because it's easy, it's cheap, and it's pretty deterministic, so we can catch all the bugs early. Then we are more like strategic regarding the integration test, because we need to make sure that a couple of components which works as a chain or as a team, better to say, right, that it all works fine. And when it comes to end-to-end tests, it's quite flaky, it's quite complex, so we really need to decide what to test. And basically, it's even better if we can automate it, so that whenever we create some pull request or commit something directly to main, we can have all these things running and be sure that at least we do not break anything, right? So now the task would be to apply that to AI systems, where we need to have very custom criteria, and we really need to be quite creative about that. So that's going to be our plan. We are going to discuss first unit tests, then integration tests, then end-to-end tests, and finally we're going to have some best practices for that. That's our plan. And I prefer to start from unit tests, because we need to have a lot of them in our system to cover all the functionality. And here are some examples to maybe start thinking of unit tests for AI agents. We can test prompts, we can test tools, because generally when we're talking about AI agents, we mean to have some tests. And finally, nowadays we can even create something like agent as a tool. I believe quite a lot of you try to do that, because now it's a very nice option to like create really complex agents, and this also can be tested. To start from, I just wanted to say a couple of things about prompt validation, because in most systems we do create this prompt automatically. So basically, depending on what's going on, we kind of create the structure of our prompt, and we can validate that. So we can make sure that our prompt contains specific fields like description or maybe the IDO folder or whatever makes sense for your specific task. It can be done, and same we can do for our output, especially if it's a structured output like JSON, and our downstream systems really depend on what's going on before. We can validate the format. It can be very deep, including the types of our fields. It can be more like generic, but we can do that. That's very small and fits under unit test very, very nicely. Then we can do some tool input-output validation as well, especially if we do have a lot of tools. And those tools can represent different APIs. We need to make sure that for any scenarios we can use that. And here I have like just a small code examples. It's implemented in Python because, data science is implemented in Python. Maybe now I should add JavaScript, but mostly it's Python, right? That's how it might look like, right? So you just come up with the good scenario and you cover it with some scheme change or maybe output checks, and it looks pretty nicely. Now, to make it a bit more complex, if you are happy with the formats, it's time to check the content, right? We actually want just not to just have some JSONs. We need to make sure that the content there is relevant. And basically, there are two ways how we can do that. It's either comparison-based evaluation. In this case, we need to have some experts who will be writing for us some nice outputs, like in this situation, please answer something like that. For this question, that would be a good answer. And in this case, we can do our evaluation like the comparison-based. There are a lot of ways how we can do that. For instance, some semantic similarity checks, when we try to do some encodings, transform our text into vectors, and then evaluate something like cosine similarity between our vectors to make sure that in the space of meanings, they are similar, right? That would be a good strategy, and no AI involved. Very nice, right? Or we can do some direct scoring. In this case, it's easier a bit because you don't need to have any ground truth, right? But in this case, you would need to create some criteria which would be based on just the output, right? So it might be a bit more tricky. Like whether the output of my agent in the right corporate style. Well, in this case, you would need to describe very well what is your corporate style. Or maybe it's easier to just get some examples, and in this case, check whether they are similar or not. So it really works both ways. And yeah, the example about corporate style is very specific, and quite often you cannot really create a good rule to check that. And in this case, you can do some LLM as a judge approach. This is very trendy and popular nowadays because we know that LLMs are very good into comparing things and acting regarding the very nice instructions. So whenever we are able to come with very nice criteria, like we believe that the output is in corporate style if it's polite, it's nice, it has positive sentiment, and what's not, otherwise it's in our style. If we are able to come up with this kind of criteria, we are actually lucky, so we can automate our evaluation without having some human experts who literally read one by one and say, nice, nice, not nice, right? That's very good. And it's much easier than generate the output. Because, the caveat, the problem is that whenever we create LLM as a judge approach, it's, again, LLM-based application, right? So it's we need to validate this now. And it's definitely a problem here. It should be validated, and it's always good whenever you create this LLM as a judge approach, you can read some outputs yourself and see whether you're actually happy with the evaluation. So if it's very much aligned with your experts. Whenever it's aligned, you can then just save the criteria and continue reusing that. So I believe it's really good investment. But still, that should be validated. And yeah, the idea is that you can automate those kind of evaluations, create for you a collection of LLM judges, maybe 5, 10, 15, depending on how thorough you are with your system, and use it for quite a lot of data sets. Moving on, how to implement that. Again, this is an example with Python, and in this case, you just need to come up with some criteria. It's right there. In this case, that's safety example. We say that the response is safe when, and then your list of criteria. And when response is unsafe, you can also create some list of criteria there. And then whenever you made any changes and you applied your AI agent for some set of cases, you can score your outputs with your LLM as a judge and just see like the share of safe and unsafe. And maybe you can get some threshold on there, like maybe not more than 10% of unsafe or maybe even zero unsafe. And whenever you reach it, you can move on with the deployment. So that's a very nice approach, and I really like it because you can be really very detailed and very creative about that, right? So you can check basically everything. As soon as you are able to describe it in words, that's great. Then moving on to the integration tests. Here it's very interesting because quite often, and the REC system is my favorite example, it really works in the pairs of components. So for instance, for REC system, you need to implement the retrieval part and then the generation part. And two things should be working together. So what can we test there? We can test quite a lot of things related to environment and configuration, because I always hear a lot of stories that something works on my local machine, but then I deploy on the server and there is no OpenAI key or whatever, so that's things should be tested. Then some tools and API integration, especially if there are quite a lot of tools which you just call by API and there is the specific format of the output and some fields might be not presented there, so those things need to be tested. And yeah, memory, state propagation, planning and routing agent, and what's not. And I'm not going to bore you with the whole list of metrics. I just want to give maybe one or two examples and move on to testing, because it's really system specific. So if it's RAG system, it's more related to the retrieval things. If it's agent, maybe it's better to make sure that the agent works well with all your tools, right? And that's some examples of what you can measure. Basically, for instance, if you have intent detection, which returns to you the topic, and then you expect that the next component will be acting based on the topic retrieved, you need to make sure that it understands correctly, right? And things related to some combinations. Moving to more complex end-to-end tests. This is first small example which I wanted to show. So from the first look, you can say that everything works. So you have a question, you have an answer, no problems there. But actually, if you think about it deeply, do you really want to spend the ability of your system, or in other words, your tokens, to helping people flatten the list in Python? Well, 100% LLM can do that. In terms of the formats of outputs, everything is correct, but is that the scenario you want to happen there? Probably not really, right? It's better to say, well, I can flatten Python, but that's an assistance about the other things, so I'm not helping with that. Or it's you who decide how exactly you want to process these kind of things. And this is the perfect example of why do we need to have these end-to-end tests. So we need to make sure that we are happy with the all different user scenarios and the way our system treats that. How to implement these things? Well, basically, we need to test some typical user's journey. So what happens when the system receives the queries which we expect to get, right? Some business-critical flows, maybe it's related to some order cancellations, maybe to some bookings, maybe to some security questions, right? So there are a lot of things. And yeah, when I say there are many things to test, I'm kind of referring to many data sets for testing, right? And a lot of experts to attracted to the process of case generation. Well, how it can be implemented? Basically, there are two ways. It's either manual, it's like literally using and reading the outputs of your AI agents just to make sure that before any deployment you ask something about competitors, ask something about orders, try to somehow get the passwords or what's not, and see what's the output, or automated. If we do automated, we need to make sure that we are able to implement some LLM as a judge approach or what's not, maybe on the individual output level, maybe for the whole session to check whether the issue or the question was resolved correctly, but it's tricky to implement. But I still believe very good investment. And how it can be done? I believe the very important part is the test configuration. So it's always good when you can create very nice formats so that you can summarize what is the scenario, what is the user profile, what is the intent, what is happening, what tools can be used, and what is the desired output. Even though you do it manually, it's a very nice thing you can provide for your testers so that they know what to test for. If you can automate it, it's even better. So that's how we can kind of structure our thinking about that. And then finally, we can kind of implement everything. And yeah, to wrap it up a little bit, there are a lot of things related to different metrics like unit tests, integration tests, end-to-end tests, but it's quite overwhelming, right? And I always prefer to be very practical about like taking the particular steps to resolve our testing and make sure that we are deploying safely. First of all, observability is the key, right? Whenever you deploy something to production, it's like it's been before with the software testing, like a standard one. Before you deploy anything, you need to implement logging, right? So no logs, no production, you know that. Here it's very similar, but in this case, we're more talking about tracing because we need to have more data related to input, output, tool used, the API used version of the models and what's not, right? So basically the good idea would be to just log and trace everything, like every piece of data you have in our application. It's very, very helpful because at least you'll be able to read through this. I mean, like literally see and read what was the question, what was the context, what was there, right? What tools was used, etc. Then later on, you will be able to automate it, even maybe in the next stage. But having logs is essential. So that's a start. Then we move into some test cases, and as we discussed before, there are a lot of topics to cover, like typical user scenarios, some adversarial scenarios, and what's not. So it's really good to invest in some data sets. It's always good when you can just collect like maybe 10 good questions to be asked, like how to book order, how to cancel order, how to find the status of your order, how to find the contact from your manager, whatever, right? 10 questions would be enough. Even if you change prompts regularly, maybe play around with different providers, maybe add more tools, just to make sure that you did not break like previous scenarios or anything like that. And then you can iterate over your data sets, and it's especially important when your product related not to some general topic, but maybe to medical things, or to law, or to economy. For instance, for me, I cannot really create a good data set for medicine usage, right? Because I'm not an expert and then don't know what questions should be there. But if you have the domain expert involved, this person can really help you to get the better understanding on what is the expectations of great output, and your system will be just better because you know how to score that. I believe for any domain area it works. Then finally, data sets. As I mentioned before, you don't have to have all the data sets from the very beginning, but maybe starting from like most popular questions. Then add some questions about your competitors, because you probably don't want your assistant to praise other companies over yours one, right? To say, well, you're better use something else because they have like better prices or what's not. Well, they might have, but it's not what you want, right? So maybe test for that as well. Some maybe forbidden topics, right? Maybe you just don't want to get your assistant involved in some medical advices or political discussions, just like not talking about that. Maybe some sales offers, because I believe a lot of you seen that very nice example when Chevrolet was sold for $1 by assistant, right? So we just don't want this to happen. Maybe if they had some data set with these things, it just would be covered, right? So it's also a very good idea to create a data set with some offers and just see what's happening when users ask about that. And yeah, to sum up, it's really important to start somewhere. I mean, even just reading through traces is the good start. Then we can iterate on top of this, make it more complex, more detailed, add some more tests on different levels. But I believe it's always good practice to include this time for monitoring, setting up into the project budget, if I can say so, and just make sure that you have some observability and understanding on what's going on with your application, because only a measuring, only evaluation gives you a chance to like grow and to improve things which is happening with your AI system in production. I would stop here. Thank you so much, and I'm happy to answer any questions.